I'm really privileged to offer this talk tonight, and thank you all for tuning in, especially those on the East Coast for whom it starts to get a little bit later. I'm looking forward to discussing with you at the end, taking your questions, and so on. I wrote a very technical introduction, which I'll dive into in a moment, but really this talk proceeds on the supposition that both my grandma and Aristotle were actually right. Most folks who know me fairly well know that much of my theological work is really inspired by that idea. I try to have my cake and eat it too, to some degree. So we try to retain classical theism on the one side, but also satisfy the more biblicist critiques and concerns on the other. And that's really what's interested me for so long in handling the scriptural propositions involving God's passions or emotions. Really, my approach to this and what I think that the system of something like a Thomas Aquinas can get you is, again, yeah, both Grandma and Aristotle were right, and kind of applying those insights from both in reading Holy Scripture is kind of where I'm coming from, although in a more technical form in this lecture, as we'll see. So I view this talk as verging toward the whole explanation of why Grandma, Aristotle, we can have our cake and eat it too. Although I do think likely my own grandma would be a bit startled by some of the things we're going to cover tonight. I do hold that if she thought it through, she would come to the conclusion at the end that, yeah, that's basically the way it is. Although we don't often say it quite like that, or perhaps posture ourselves towards the text in that hardcore of a fashion. But with that said, without further delay, let's just get into it here and proceed. So theologians are forced by, for example, Aristotelianism to run roughshod over Holy Scripture and rejigger its propositions, especially those involving divine passions, as though they said anything but. Regardless of what Holy Scripture says, and it frequently and frankly says God is angered, he's merciful, and so on, regardless of this, the facts are altogether otherwise. Facts as we know them from Aristotle. And there are quite remarkable gymnastics which manifest just how doggedly this altogether otherwise is followed. Perhaps the most vivid example is when theologians confront the scriptural propositions like God being angered and reach for almost anything else besides anger to handle the letters. God being angered means everything from Satan himself to divine love, but does not and cannot mean God is angered, at least according to the Aristotelian system, where we demonstrate that God has no passions, anger and many others being among them. But theologians also suffer other constraints beside Aristotle. They also have the duty to do justice to the letters of Holy Scripture. Yet, as those whom I will call biblicists rightly point out, pleading metaphor has not done so. And by pleading metaphor here, I mean interpreting God being variously impassioned as anything else except somehow having said passions. And there are many possibilities here besides these passions. For example, God being merciful, we might interpret as we are saved. An interpretation which not only posits nothing of mercy in God, but also says nothing actually about him. So biblicists will say that these sorts of accounts of pleading just metaphor do not do justice to the letters of Holy Scripture. The scriptural propositions involving divine passions, whether God being angered, him being merciful, and so on, they're differentiated, biblicists will tell you, from obvious metaphors like God being a rock. They're obviously proper formal, indistinguishable from other propositions like God being love, which even theologians admit is not a metaphor. The prophet uses these propositions as principles of argument for many conclusions. And in order to sufficiently argue these conclusions, the propositions need to be understood again properly and formally, otherwise there's no argumentative force. The prophets will, again, even argue extensively for these propositions. God being angered is not just a premise, but also a conclusion. All this and more, from the the biblicist perspective, manifests that for the prophet, these are not just metaphors. And theologians have not done justice to the letters by pleading such. In this lecture, I basically want to concede and say guilty as charged, except the biblicist critics have only heard half the story that theologians tell, the half where they plead just metaphor. There is also a second half where theologians actually try and do justice to the letters. That other half of the story is that these propositions, again, God being angered, him being merciful, and so on, these are dialectical principles of argument, and taken at face value, they are being used by the prophets to conclude many truths. The whole story, then, involves two perspectives. From the perspective of the prophet, the propositions are true, but only metaphorical. Yet being proposed dialectically, the same propositions are, from the perspective of the people, proper, although admittedly false. This is the whole story, the whole position. It holds that these propositions are both true, yes, but also proper, but considered in different modes. That's the have your cake and eat it too impulse that you find in me showing through. I should say up front here that this second half of the story, which we want to handle tonight, if you want the first half, you're going to have to take my upcoming course. This second half of the story is also not going to be agreeable to the biblicists. In point of fact, it will likely be more alarming. It amounts to saying, to put it aggressively, fine, the propositions are proper, but accordingly false. It's kind of a pick your poison situation here, either true but metaphorical or proper yet false. Interestingly enough, the whole story says, I'll take both pills, yes, please. Regardless, though, besides being the case, this account, and this is the important part I want us to focus on this evening, this account also has the advantage of actually doing justice to the letters of Holy Scripture. And the fact that justice is done, I believe biblicists will have to admit, although again, they will not appreciate this position. Still, and what is important for us, is that this provides at least an equally adequate account as the biblicist position to explaining the concrete phenomenon of Holy Scripture, the actual data on the page, if you will. The biblicist simply cannot claim that it has a leg up when it comes to the letters, as if there's somehow a point in his favor. No, the biblicist is one attempt, ultimately errant, to do justice to the letters. The theologians, on the other hand, appeal to dialectical propositions, and this is an equal attempt to do justice to the same, and ultimately an attempt that is successful and correct. All right. We have a lot to cover here tonight, but let's expound our central point. Propositions involving divine passions are dialectical and thus proper formal. This is what we'll handle. First of all, we're going to unpack what this means. Then second, we're going to handle how these dialectical propositions still are grounded according to the prophet's judgments. Talking about this is the same we'll find as doing allegory, rather than reading the text ad literam, which concentrates on, for lack of better terms, the dialectical use. At the end, I'll conclude by circling back and facing off once more the way the theologian faces the text versus the way the biblicist does. All right. First of all, what do we mean by dialectical propositions? Well, let me begin by initially alarming you. Ultimately, I hope to quiet your fears, all the way really at the end almost of the lecture, but you need to hear the scary part first. Recall Plato in his Republic, where he famously advances the geneon pseudos, today badly rendered as the one noble lie, which would serve as the founding mythos or myth of the city. The philosopher, Socrates suggests, should propose that the citizens of the city all have bodies from earth, whereas they also have souls of gold, silver, and iron/bronze. For saying this story, the people would conclude that they are all the same, all men, but also all different. Some rulers, some warriors, others farmers and craftsmen, and so on. From the perspective of many church fathers, the so-called noble lies are not infrequent in Holy Scripture. A possible New Testament example comes to mind here, the Antiochian incident when Paul rebukes Peter to his face, recounted in Galatians 2. According to certain fathers, Origen included, Paul and Peter staged everything and faked their confrontation to teach Jews and Gentiles and thus make them. This interpretation was rendered in church history especially famous due to the strident debate between Jerome and Augustine, the former who includes Origen's interpretation in his own Galatians commentary, and then the latter, Augustine, becoming very disturbed by this and suspecting that it undercuts the truthfulness of Holy Scripture. Nevertheless, at least from the supposedly Origen's perspective, this is a geneon pseudes, a founding mythos, if you will, of the New Testament city. Well, regardless of what one thinks about this particular example, the fathers commonly hold that the Old Testament version of this is the variously impassioned God. For them, God being angered, him being merciful, and other scriptural propositions like this is perhaps the prophetic mythos founding the Old Testament city. Now, there will be real grounds for speaking of the variously impassioned God, grounds like concrete divine works, divine providence, and so on. We'll speak to these later in our lecture, but mature readers can apprehend these as they practice allegory. Forgetting this, laying this to the side, the mythos can also be taken as it stands, whereupon it, among other things, enables somebody to intellectually derive many true conclusions also about reality. Conclusions like somebody is going to be punished given his sin, or we are going to be saved given divine goodness, and so on. These conclusions, immature readers must content themselves with, given that they're not strong enough to transcend bodily forms. They thus read, the fathers would say, only ad literam. Each person, Origen reminds, according to his capacity, understands the scriptures. One takes the sense from them more superficially, as if from the surface level of a spring, whereas another draws up more deeply as from a well, but both can be helped, since the same thing to one is a spring, but to the other a well. Another way of putting all this, and slightly less scary than coming out and speaking of Plato's geneon pseudos, is that these propositions involving divine passions are dialectical. They're dialectical endoxa or opiniones, take your pick. What does this mean? Well, we cannot reproduce here entirely what is a dialectician and are just following Aristotle. But most important for our purposes is that a dialectician does, or at least can, argue a conclusion from merely plausible propositions, endoxa, to use the Greek, or probabilis opiniones, to use scholastic Latin. Namely, the propositions that are held to be true by everybody, or at least by many of a certain group, whether that group is the dialectician's audience or those whom the audience trusts. Notably, in many cases, these propositions are held by the hearers as true, but nonetheless, in reality, they're false. Moreover, the dialectician sometimes knows this. In some cases, the same false to fact propositions will also be held by the dialectician as false. He will, in fact, dissent from them and hold their opposites. Still, the dialectician will use these propositions as principles for arguing certain conclusions that he does hold as true and which the audience ought to as well. In simple terms, then, a dialectician accepts his hearers' opening terms, their stock of propositions they hold as true, and he operates from the beginning according to their initial assumptions. To speak as the scholastics would, the dialectician will use premises which are true secundum opinionem, according to opinion, especially that of his hearers. But he deploys these insofar as they can conclude other propositions which are true secundum rem, or in actual fact, and which the dialectician himself holds as such. Even then, in the case of actually false propositions as opening premises, the dialectician can hoodwink his hearers into holding other and actually true ones as his closing conclusions. The dialectician thus can and does use false propositions as his principles of argument. And we find this not infrequently in Holy Scripture, as the prophets argue like dialecticians with their hearers. A prime example of this, a major case in point, is all the various ways that the prophets say God is variously impassioned. This fact will be uncomfortable to many today, and initially it also seems to undercut Holy Scripture's truthfulness, something that even St. Augustine was worried about. Additionally, it seems to open up the prophets to the charge of actual lying. These really are the two pressure points. I don't try to hide them from you. I suspect that careful listeners have already spotted, oh my goodness, these are two unpleasant and also false ideas that we would want to safeguard against, and or if they're enclosed in the account I'm offering here, that account would therefore be incorrect, and we'd have to go back to the drawing board and so on and so forth. We know Holy Scripture always returns true judgments, and we also know the Holy Prophets never lie. These are kind of our suppositions here, but regardless. Despite the difficulties, though, this position is held explicitly by many of the church fathers, like Clement or Origen. Moreover, scholastics not uncommonly remark in various ways that some propositions in Holy Scripture involve, in fact, false judgments, which the audience assents to, but the prophet dissents from. Abelard, for one, develops this idea, particularly under the pressure of needing to resolve conflicting patristic authorities. Sometimes he says, the fathers will propose what they don't assent to, but which others hold as true. Likewise, in Holy Scripture, we can see this occur. Maimonides, the great Jewish theologian, for another example, identifies this issue as his seventh cause of contradiction in written texts. Namely, when a dialectician issues now one premise, but then also its opposite, as he argues at various points for different conclusions. If somebody later brings these respective premises together, he will find that they are both parts of a real contradiction, whereupon necessarily one is true and the other false. That this occurs also in Holy Scripture, as Maimonides insinuates, is little wonder when the Torah argues from the opinions of the sons of man, even while it gradually corrects their errors. These sayings, then, will be dialectical first principles of argument, true according to people's opinion, but not according to actual fact. No less than Thomas Aquinas himself deploys this to interpret Exodus 33:11 when God is said to speak to Moses face to face. According to reality, the negative is true. Yet here the prophet, quote, is speaking rather according to the opinion of the people who were thinking that Moses was speaking mouth to mouth with God, close quote. Their judgment was false to fact, although obviously their mistake was understandable in that, quote, God spoke and appeared to Moses through some instrumentalized creature, such as through an angel or through a cloud, close quote. We need to understand this issue very carefully. So let's break it down and continue to unpack this idea so that we're straight. So, to be perfectly clear on what we mean here, take a certain contradiction and suppose that, according to reality, its negative is true, but according to common opinion, it's affirmative. The prophets are willing to argue from the affirmative, even though they themselves dissent from it. They thus willingly use people's false propositions as their own principles of argument. Maimonides, again, is quite helpful here in outlining this procedure when God, particularly, is the subject. Maimonides speaks to both the predicates that are used by the prophets frequently, and then also the true conclusions argued. Unpacking both of these is worth our time. Again, I want you to kind of get a whole view of this thing. We're concentrating on the passions of God, but really, this is a whole vision of how the prophets work. So we need to kind of grasp something of that whole. So let's unpack both of these. On the one hand, Maimonides says that the prophets compromised regarding what really is among creatures versus what everyday people think about such. They accommodated themselves to everyday people's opinions and therefore were often usurping two sorts of predicates into their speech about God. The first sort was whatever, according to common opinion, is good or perfect, or else evil and imperfect. The former, we see the prophets affirm of God, saying, for example, God sees, because seeing is the most perfect sense act. The latter, these imperfect or evil things, they negated from God or merely did not affirm. So, example here, God has intestines. They never say, because intestines and all of their affairs, to state the obvious, are disgusting among all men. The second sort of predicate, though, was whatever not according to fact, but only according to common opinion, is somehow useful and or necessary for something. For example, an eye is necessary for seeing, or a hand is useful for working, and so on. And so, the prophets also said that God has eyes, that he has a hand, and so forth. Notably, both these sorts of predicates follow the understandings of reality only so far as everyday persons are concerned, not as actually is the case, which is what we handle in philosophy. But on the other hand, the prophets then use these respective principles, especially for arguing for two sorts of conclusions. The first sort of predicate or proposition, like God sees, was for conclusions about God himself, as when the prophet affirms something held to be a perfection, so that we conclude God is altogether perfect, or even merely that God exists or is real, Maimonides will note. The second sort of predicate, though, propositions like God has a hand, were rather for conclusions about divine works. The prophet says that God has a hand because everyday people hold that having a hand is necessary for working, and so we conclude from this proposition a certain divine operation or work. This second sort of proposition, the false but plausibly held propositions which conclude divine works, is most frequent in Holy Scripture, which primarily speaks of divine works rather than God himself. And furthermore, the many scriptural propositions, God being variously impassioned, reduced to this too. They are false propositions concluding divine works. In light of this, we ought to further reflect upon this category, both more generally and then more particularly. Again, filling out the prophetic logic here, I want you to try and catch a glimpse of just the whole panoramic vision so you really get to come to grips with what the prophets are doing with these dialectical premises. So first and more generally, this sort of thing happens with scriptural propositions involving names from, for example, our bodily part. The prophet will use God having a bodily part as his principle of argument. He proposes it for the sake of concluding God doing something. Thus, for example, God having eyes is his principle or a premise. God knowing something is his conclusion. And everything which has eyes knows is his middle premise. Perhaps the most striking text here is Psalm 94:9. He who implanted the ear, will he not hear? Who formed the eye, will he not see? The prophet is arguing against those who were holding that the Lord will not see nor heed, verse 7. One reason why they held this is because they also held that God lived in the sky, that there are clouds between us and him, whereupon just as clouds block our seeing God in the sky, likewise they block him seeing us on the ground. Again, Job 22:14 says this explicitly. Notably, from this false judgment, God will not see or hear, people were further inclined to hurt the helpless. This is the prophetic problem in Psalm 94. And so, the prophet argues against this false judgment, and for the true one, namely that God both sees, i.e., knows, and hears, i.e., loves, the helpless, he begins to do what is so often done in Holy Scripture. He gives as the principle for that conclusion that God has eyes and ears. This is his dialectical principles of argument. And for this dialectical principle, the prophet argues in this fashion. First, everyone who gives something must first have it. God gives us eyes and ears, and therefore he has them. But second, and more, when those who are spirit give something to bodies, they first of all have them in an even higher way. Accordingly, God doesn't just have eyes and ears, he has them in a higher way. He has super eyes and super ears. This latter strengthening is important, given so often the Jewish people were being condemned as having eyes but not seeing, ears but not hearing, just like the idols. The prophet, therefore, makes us conclude that God has even more perfect eyes and more perfect ears than we do, that cannot fail to see the things upon earth. And so we ultimately conclude he sees and hears, i.e., knows and loves the helpless, and or is specially inclined to the pitiful. This then is an example of a prophet compromising and using false but plausibly held propositions as his principles of argument. His ultimate conclusion is God does know all and does help the helpless. His principles are that he sees, and even before this, that God has eyes. The prophet is, of course, arguing with people who hold many and other more destructive errors, like God living in the sky, or clouds and darkness covering our evil deeds. Yes, very problematic to think. They also hold less destructive errors, like God needing eyes to see and ears to hear in the first place. The prophet argues dialectically, accepting at least some of these opening terms. All right, second, and more particularly, though, the same thing also occurs for propositions involving names from our passions. Yes, this is what you came and paid for. Propositions like God being angered or him being merciful. This same thing occurs. The prophet also uses these false propositions to conclude divine works, like him punishing or him saving, arguing, for example, everyone angered punishes. God is angered. Therefore, or even, nobody saves unless they're merciful. God is merciful, and therefore he likely saves. This concludes plausibly. Here again, we revert to Maimonides, quite helpful in this regard. I apologize, I suppose, for citing him too much, but you can't help but love Maimonides. He calls propositions like God being angered and being merciful necessary beliefs, by contrast to propositions like God not being a body, which are correct beliefs, both of which Holy Scripture makes us to hold. Maimonides speaks of beliefs because both these sorts are held volitionally through authorities. He might equally well speak of endoxa or opiniones because these propositions are not held demonstratively but only plausibly if we offer intellectual arguments. The latter propositions, like God not being a body, are correct, namely, true, not just according to opinion, but also secundum rem, according to actual fact. The former, though, are false according to actual fact, yet still their holding, he says, is necessary, i.e., useful. This is Thomas's sense of necessary, just as a horse is necessary for a journey. They're necessary, i.e., useful, for everyday people for the sake of various ends. Those ends can be intellectual, like concluding something, our intention here and throughout, or they can be volitional and moral, like Maimonides' actual intention in context of what he says. Consider here two quotations back to back. Let me read them. Quote, "The law," Maimonides says, "also makes a call to adopt certain beliefs, beliefs in which is necessary for the sake of political welfare." You hear Plato in the background. Yes, continuing. "Such, for instance, is our belief that God, may he be exalted, is violently angry with those who disobey him, and that it is therefore necessary to fear him and to dread him and to take care not to disobey." All right, here's another quote. Quote, "In some cases, a commandment communicates a correct belief, which is the one and only thing aimed at. as, for instance, the belief in the unity and eternity of God and in Him not being a body. In other cases, the belief is necessary for the abolition of reciprocal wrongdoing or for the acquisition of a noble moral quality, as, for example, the belief that God, may He be exalted, has violent anger against those who do injustice, according to what is said, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill, and so on. And such is the belief that God, may He be exalted, responds instantaneously to the prayer of somebody wronged or deceived. Quote, and it shall come to pass when He cries unto me, I will hear, for I am merciful. Close quote. So to summarize Maimonides here, Holy Scripture, or more particularly its letters, make us to hold judgments that are true according to reality, like God not being a man, but it also makes us to hold judgments which, although not true, are still, in light of our current intellectual or volitional state, useful for our further knowledge and love. For example, God being merciful, whereupon we know God hears our prayers, or God being angered, whereupon we fear to sin. So we're striking here at the genesis of the many and sundry propositions, God being variously impassioned. The prophets, to summarize, are constructing something like a dialectical maze to funnel the majority of people through to the right outlets. In fact, let me just zoom out and try to give you a one-off theoretical explanation, this overarching survey of that dialectical maze so you can really grasp what's going on here. So suppose at first, the prophet began to say that God sees. And the reason he did so was because among men of all the various sense acts, seeing is the most perfect. The prophet did this to insinuate God's perfection, so that we would conclude that everything is known to God. But then people asked, well, how does God see? And some people doubted that God sees at all because he lacks a body. And so the prophet continues, and he begins to say, God sees with his eyes see all, and so on. Again, the prophet does this to insinuate his power to know, and so that we would hold that everything indeed is known to God, and no wise doubt this. Then people start to ask, what about our prayers? And some people were doubting regarding their cries for divine help because neither of these are visible. So the prophet begins to say that God also hears, and then more, that his ears hear, that our calls enter into his ears, and so on. These, again, are dialectical propositions. Well, then people asked, well, if all is known to God, then what could be done by him regarding us? As what is good if we have knowledge, but somebody lacks ability? And so the prophet begins to say, God is strong. And this was so that we would conclude that none can resist God, that he has ordered all according to his most certain providence and other similar truths. Yet here again, some doubt God is strong, especially seeing the fact that many of his works are hidden or attributed to somebody else as his instrument, and so on. And so the prophets continue yet, and they say, God has a right hand, his arm is not so short as to save, and so on. They even begin to speak of his weapons, his tools, all of this so that we would conclude that God is strong, and we would not conclude that none can resist him. Finally, people asked, if all is known to God, and if God can do all things, well, then what would he do? Seeing that knowledge and ability will count for nothing unless somebody wants to act. This problem was very serious. Serious for many reasons. like the wicked flourishing, the poor being oppressed, the fact that divine help is long in coming, his punishments are afar off, and very frequently so detached from their ultimate causes. The prophets, therefore, seize upon the most powerful and most evident means whereby we are induced to act, namely our passions, and they say these of God. And so they say, God was angered, so that we would conclude sin is punished. They said he was merciful, so that we would conclude our prayers are important, and many, many other truths of this sort. These all were dialectical principles of argument. We can see then that the prophets create this dialectical maze within Holy Scripture. Many and perhaps most people never get out of the dialectical maze, but just stay within it. This doesn't become a problem, except when you theologize about the dialectical propositions and take them as communicating reality. Grandma does not have a problem reading these dialectical propositions and having them operate upon her. Only the biblicist, I'm going to get radical, only the biblicist pseudo-theologian has a problem when he starts to take these things to the bank and as a map to reality, as the so-called biblical categories for how the world works and so on. And I really want to underline this here. It's important to understand normal people will read the text and get along just fine. You get problems when so-called theologians, one, refuse to do actual theology and listen to Aristotle. Yeah. For heaven's sake, be precise. Things of this sort, what we do in scholasticism, yes. But then further, they pretend to do pseudo-theology and listen to Holy Scripture with their eyes closed to demonstrated facts, reality as it stands. This is where things really get problematic and where I start to get animated. All right. Let's move on, though, to our second point, much shorter here. Don't be afraid. Prophets as philosophers and the need for reading allegorically. We're covering a lot of ground, but we need to continue to fill things out a little bit more and try and justify some of these dialectical proposition usages and so on and so forth. I need to remind you that the prophets were not just dialecticians playing some sort of shell game with people. They were firstly philosophers or theologians who themselves knew reality as it actually is inside and out. The prophets had in their minds both true and false judgments about God and creatures. They assented to the former and, of course, dissented from the latter. The prophets themselves were not confused or beguiled. They did not suffer the errors of the common man, although they were keenly aware of those errors. Their minds were filled with supernatural divine light, and from this wellspring of knowledge of reality as such, they were proposing, uttering propositions, although notably proposing to fundamentally two different sorts of people, debtors both to the wise and to the unwise. I am, of course, here referring to Philo's distinction between how we divide up the various propositions in the text of Holy Scripture. So far, we've been considering only their dialectical propositions delivered to the unwise, the majority of sayings in Holy Scripture, where the prophets say God is angered, he's merciful, and so on. The prophets, though, also proposed reality as it is, speaking to the wise. Yes, they did this rarely, resulting in very few propositions you're going to find in the sacred text, and they did so primarily negatively. As they would say, God is one, God is not a body, and so on. What then of the majority of these other sayings in Holy Scripture? are they just for the unwise alone? Well, the fathers teach us that these propositions, God being angered, being merciful, etc., the vast majority of the scriptural text, these propositions are directly for the unwise, yes, the normies out there, of which we ought to count ourselves as, finding ourselves mostly within, yes, directly for the unwise, but indirectly for the wise as well. To put this another way, we as readers of the sacred texts can read these propositions either as immature persons or as mature ones. We're facing here what the fathers call reading ad literam versus reading allegorically. This then is retracing both halves to the whole story, metaphor where we read allegorically, but then dialectical argument where we read ad literam. So again, the prophets propose, for example, God is angered. Immature readers must content themselves with reading this ad literam, and they profit, intellectually speaking, from these dialectical propositions only insofar as the conclusions derived are true and are held as such precisely on account of the dialectical propositions. Yet on the other hand, mature readers can also profit from these dialectical propositions, not as principles arguing the conclusions, but as themselves. Mature readers profit from dialectical propositions by reading not ad literam, but reading allegorically. Accordingly, although these propositions are directly for the unwise and the sole focus of immature readers, they are indirectly for the wise as well, and also must be their focus, not being read ad literam, but being read allegorically. Let's unpack this here. So the practice of allegory, where the biblicist starts to get uncomfortable, is only to be done by mature readers. And indeed, it can be done only in proportion to their maturity. The practice of allegory responds to the question, what is the ratio veritatis, or the verification principle of the proposition, for example, God is angered? Or as Augustine phrases, ratio veritatis, as Thomas phrasing, as Augustine phrases, how is it said, quomodo dicator, that, for example, God is merciful? These are the just metaphor interpretations of the propositions, which biblicists take issue with as not doing justice to the letters. Well, they're not concerned to do justice to the letters. They're concerned to how speak of these letters as true faced against reality. If we want to do justice to the text, we have to face the other way and work dialectically. Here, we're not doing so. Initially, we see, and in more minor allegorical traditions, we see allegorical reading is much more controlled, if you like, and attached to the original dialectical argument. And so the fathers will exchange the prophet's intellectual principle for arguing or for our knowing God doing something. They'll put that off and they'll exchange it for the real divine principle for God actually doing so. So you see the fathers rewrite the dialectical argument all the time in their texts. God having eyes, i.e., him having intellectual power. Everything which has eyes sees. God having eyes was put for him having intellectual power, i.e., him knowing rather than just physically seeing, and so on. You see these slight adjustments that the fathers employ. Moreover, the initial dialectical proposition is considered as signifying these sorts of judgments. So Thomas will say, quote, "Eye is said of God, and it signifies his virtue for seeing in an intelligible, not sensible way." intellectual knowledge, nothing to do with the body. This then is the common interpretation of these propositions outside their use as dialectical principles. This is the important part. Outside their use. Note the difference. Outside the argument, God having eyes was put for him having intellectual power, which is what this signifies. But inside the dialectical argument, him having eyes was uttered for the sake of us concluding God knows. The latter pertains to our knowing and the ad literam readings of Holy Scripture, whereas the former pertains to reality and is the allegorical reading of the text. Eventually, however, allegorical reading becomes more unhinged, as some would say, and entirely detached from the dialectical argument. It starts to take these dialectical propositions, which were used to argue, now as isolated and altogether on their own, and it attempts to entirely found their truth in actual fact by identifying all the different sorts of judgments which do found this prophetic utterance. And here, of course, things become more and more uncomfortable for biblicist readers because it now is entirely unhooked from the letter and the use of the proposition in Holy Scripture. We now, one might say, are digging entirely beneath the surface of the text. This is where, for example, Origen labors, the so-called scary allegorists. By the way, we should note scholastic theologians like Thomas, just as scary in that they too are digging entirely underneath the letter to populate the entire world of true judgments which do support this prophetic utterance. That's what the scholastics are all about. They're not about reading the dialectic, they're about getting to truth and facts. We need to note that this practice of allegory that I'm speaking of here in gesture form is forced by the combined fact that Holy Scripture returns true judgments, but also, second fact, Aristotelian demonstrations say God being variously impassioned is false. Indeed, your awareness of the need to read allegorically is going to correspond only to your Aristotelian awakening. This is what will populate the field of the intellect with many negative judgments whose truths are demonstrated scientifically. And thereupon, when you approach the letters, you'll see they operate dialectically and conclude various truths. You'll recognize that obviously this is not sufficient for these propositions themselves to be true, as if their truthfulness somehow derived from their function or utility in an argument. That obviously doesn't work. That's ridiculous. No, their truthfulness depends upon the intellect of the prophet and ultimately reality, which we know via Aristotle is not filled with these proper formal judgments. These are false. We therefore become aware of the need to read allegorically, regardless of what the prophet is doing with these propositions for everyday people. And more, only Aristotelian demonstrations that result in scientia are going to be ultimately sufficient to found our doing allegory, rationally speaking. Your native approach, I often tell my students, your native approach is always that the proposition is proper formal unless demonstrated otherwise, operative word being demonstrated. Nonetheless, with Aristotle in mind, we begin to practice allegory. Once again, allegory or reading otherwise than the letters say attempts to get at, one, what could be the prophet's judgments, because those judgments are true, and therefore to some extent, but perhaps not the entirety of what's under the letter, yes. Therefore, for the example, the letter, God being angered, allegory is going to start proposing our being punished or an angel working destruction or something like that to found its truth, yes, that's first of all. Ultimately, in scholasticism, though, we want to max out this set of possible true judgments and fill in the entire knowledge, prophetic knowledge of reality as such. And this, by the way, is where we actually start to get the prophets off the charge of possibly lying with their dialectical hoodwinking. The full results of allegory, where we apprehend the entire underlying true judgments and or reality in its full scope, are what actually justifies the original dialectical propositions to begin with, the prophetic simulations, if you like. Again, this and only this is what rescues the prophet from the charge of actual lying, by virtue of speaking otherwise than how reality is, by virtue of uttering propositions which, understood properly, are false, like God being angered, him being merciful, and so on. Let me revert to Plato's famous and much maligned Genaion Pseudeos. I told you I would circle back and try and lessen the scare. Yeah, here it is. The citizens of the city are told that they have bodies from earth, but souls from gold or silver or iron bronze. This obviously is false, but it is justified. I don't mean justified in the utilitarian sense of telling an actual lie, giving some resulting good like societal control or something like that. No, that obviously is still actual lying. Is not what Plato meant, and certainly is not what the prophets do. I mean justified in the intellectual sense of teaching truths through mythos, or rather, the listener acquiring truths concludable from such. Indeed, Socrates reminds us that there are two kinds of discourses, true ones and also false ones, and that we must educate people in both kinds, but will have to use false discourse first. Likewise, in Holy Scripture, the prophets are justified in proposing the way they do, precisely because reality is the way it is. And this reality they know in full. That reality, the theologian can populate on the one hand with philosophically demonstrated judgments, and also on the other by the process of allegorical reading. But all of this together puts under the letters of Holy Scripture their actual grounds, even though those grounds do not reflect the letters and neither the letters really reflect the grounds. So God being impassioned is the founding mythos of the Old Testament city. It creates a dialectical maze for popping out true conclusions, a maze which is justified by virtue of the actual lines of reality, even though the lines of reality and the lines of the maze do not match up. Again, to use God being angered as an example, because it's such a good one, this indeed is false. It's something which most people hold as true, and indeed, in a certain mode, perhaps sometimes needs to be held given certain intellectual weaknesses. And so, the prophet proposes this and says, God is angered. In his mind are concrete divine punishments, there are avenging angels and demons, even Satan himself. There's the thread of divine justice, which is woven throughout the whole created fabric. This is reality. These are the facts. This is what the prophet knows. And thus, from his perspective, the proposition God being angered is just a metaphor and a true one. Yet the proposition is being deployed as an education or a tool. From the people's perspective, the proposition is proper, whereupon it would be false, but still concluding truths which are the prophet's ultimate intention in using this tool. All right, let's bring things to a conclusion here. I began our lecture tonight by speaking of the biblicists versus the traditional theologians, particularly as they each face Holy Scripture and very much do different things with it. For biblicists, as you know, the beats are rather familiar at this point. Each and every time Holy Scripture reads God variously impassioned, it's yet another opportunity and even demand to pound away at the theologian's judgment that God is impassible. It's proof positive of its falsehood and the traditional position's error. More, the biblicist is going to argue the insufficiency of the theologian's appeal to, among other things, metaphor, not just given reality being insufficient according to reality, but insufficient given the scriptural letters, which just don't support this kind of hand-waving. Indeed, this issue is most acute and where biblicism has legs. As I noted at the start, the biblicist can note that scriptural propositions like God being angered and merciful are different from others that are obvious metaphors like him being a rock. He can note the same propositions are identical to those which the theologians understand as proper, like God being love or him being just. And perhaps most damning of all, the prophet uses these propositions involving divine passions as principles of arguing for many conclusions. And these arguments, we must admit, do not have force unless their principles are understood properly. To these and other similar arguments, the theologian cannot respond from Holy Scripture. He must admit that the biblicist runs with the grain of the letters. He must show himself not unaware of all the splinters that are required from running so determinately against the grain. Still, the theologian can and does respond in two ways. First, he can and must scientifically demonstrate the truth that God is impassible. If the biblicist is going to be armed to the teeth with scriptural propositions that say God is passion, well, then the theologian needs to respond, if not in kind, at least in equivalent measure with philosophical demonstration. Nothing else except the absolute certainty of science arising from strict demonstrations and even many demonstrations is going to be sufficient for someone to read the scriptural God is merciful and judge he is not. When we have such science in mind, one will find reading the letters easy. Beyond such philosophical demonstrations, however, second, the theologian can and must explain why and how the scriptural propositions are proper formal. He cannot rest on his laurels and plead just metaphor, which does not do justice to the text. The theologian thus appeals to the account outlined above, at least in its basics, namely, these propositions are dialectical, they're plausibly held, although in reality false. Nothing else does justice to the concrete phenomenon of Holy Scripture. And the biblicists are right to underline the insufficiency of pleading metaphor alone. Although pleading dialectical proposition is not going to be agreeable to the biblicist either, this account does do justice to the very letters and provides an alternative explanation for the concrete data. That explanation is equally as sufficient as the explanation that the biblicist holds, namely that the propositions are proper but also true. The alternative, an equally sufficient explanation of the theologian, therefore removes the sting from the biblicist arguments and reverts both sides to the neutral ground of philosophical demonstration to actually determine the question whether God has passions. And there, it's no contest. All right, let's stop there and we can get on to questions. Yeah, yeah, so you wanna try and, like, say you wanna try and soften kind of positively inputting errors and falsehoods in people's heads, the listener's head. So we're trying to kind of certainly not. It's a really complex things are complex. The account here is complex. There's a lot of things that are going on. So there are errors that, say, a hearer actually has, say, a listener of Holy Scripture, he actually has those errors, and we're not concerned about the genesis of those errors. We're just speaking to the actual occasion where the prophet comes down and he's going to work with those. The prophet is aware of those errors. The prophet is not positively investing those errors so much as citing them or re-upping them. Um, you don't want to use the word signifies here or something like that. I've been using the word involves, which is very vague. Um, like the kind of the metaphysical account of how all this proposition, two touch play goes is kind of weird. Like signifies is language that we use to describe a proposition vis-a-vis the speaker. Right? So you understand basic Aristotelianism. And according to that, they're not going to be signifying false judgments or errors. And therefore, if you look at the pure proposition as it's communicating the thought in the prophet's head, like, no, there's no falsehood involved. But still, their appearance and their presentation is proper formal on the page. They're being understood by that. And you might want to give like some sort of common understanding account of, hey, we're in this discussion together. And kind of the assumption that we have as we walk in the room is that this is the way reality is. And I'm just going to take that and I'm going to lead you along. So there's a lot that we can do to kind of soften the blow, but I don't actually think you really need to. There's enough equipment here to uphold the truthfulness of Holy Scripture, which is obvious, or ought to be obviously, the fact that it's held by everyone here ought to be obvious to everyone. Um, the fact that prophets aren't lying, okay, that's obvious. The difficulty is like giving enough of the explanation and like teasing out the metaphysics of signification of conventional signs to actually like express this fully and sufficiently. And kind of the account I've given here tonight is part of that. I think a lot of that. I think it's most of that. So going back to one thing I said, okay, special cuddle language. I suppose we're going to go with this. Again, the only problem happens when the child, not when the child thinks that and kind of loosely holds that in his mind and maybe just has like a kind of plausible opinion. He doesn't actually assent to this picture. It's operating in his imagination. He holds it very loosely. It's not a really problematic error, even say if he judges it. He's not super strong about that. The problem comes in when the child grows up and when he actually starts to believe this and he holds it and he takes it to the bank, whereupon he's all the way out of sorts. Um, Grandma, again, does not have a problem with Holy Scripture operating in this way. It actually becomes a problem when the biblicists take these propositions that are, say at most, and you would not even want to say this, like this is wrong to say, but say we want to concede the prophet really is injecting false propositions and making people hold them in their head, just like loosely. Again, this is not the case, is not what you want to say. That only becomes a problem from the biblicists when they take this to the bank and double down and say, no, this is the way reality is, and you can't think of it otherwise, which biblicists are often happily inconsistent here and are not doing that. And even a lot of like the pushback against classical theists is just because classical theists aren't honest about this or they're not sufficient and again doing justice to the letters of Holy Scripture. Whereupon you have biblicists, say, who come along and are forced to double down because they feel like you're undercutting the forcefulness of the text or something. Even worse. I have to say I'm sorry, Joe. I lost your question along the way. So what is your actual question in a word, in a short word? No worries. Sure. Yeah, so again, this where I kind of concluded is um you need to go to the mat. And actually, this is what really bothers me. Like a lot of more biblicist theologians. And by the way, when I say biblicist, I don't mean that in a snide way. Like I grew up a biblicist. My whole family is a biblicist in some degree or other. Um, you know. Anyway, my frustration is when biblicist will kind of pretend and poke at things and be choosy. They'll they'll pick some fascinating, weird John Milbank metaphysics because it fits their priors, but they won't actually engage in the difficult philosophical work that is required to operate at this sort of level. So I tell my students all the time. I alluded to this in the lecture, like you are not allowed, rationally or intellectually speaking, you are not allowed to pull the moves that the tradition plays with the text of Holy Scripture unless you have philosophical demonstrations that have resulted in scientia in your head. You're not allowed, um, rationally or intellectually speaking. And therefore, yes, uh, on the supposition that reality just is this way, and therefore, when Scripture, which only and always returns true judgments, says what it says, like this is a set of true judgments that are possible. And then that set of false judgments are therefore not possible. Yeah. And then we can also talk about, well, what are these propositions, even perhaps insofar as they involve false judgments? What are those propositions actually doing if they're being read ad literam, proper formally? Which is even kind of a really artificial, this is where some of the tension is also relieved. It's like calling a proposition a natural language proposition, which scriptural texts are natural language, even though they're, special, you know, roofy prophetic language. Calling a natural language, like isolating a line of Hebrew text and then saying, oh, this is proper formal or this is causal predication. Like, come on. This is super artificial to do. And it's true, like all the things that we're saying, we're analyzing the text, we have to do it. We have to recognize that even some of the initial anxiety is simply as a result of, do I dare say, imposing false categories on this sacred text. There I said it. So, reanalyzing normal person locution, even like we're having right now, like which one of my utterances is a singular proposition that identifies one to one a singular judgment in my head? Like that's just not how language works. And therefore, a lot of this um, anxiety comes up when we start to philosophize or theologize about the text of Holy Scripture and consider them as propositions, which of course we have to do. And biblicists are in many ways rightly saying we ought not to do, or actually think a lot of the reformers, guys like Calvin, were really exceptional at doing, like treating them as rhetoricians would treat their rhetorical arguments, and where like Calvin, who I'm often not a fan of, was a great reader of Holy Scripture precisely because he was a rhetorician. Like he wasn't a theologian, but he was a rhetorician, and therefore he understood the ad literam argument. He knows what an argument is, and that gets you a lot of what the text is doing. Whereas if you go back to a Thomas Aquinas, who's going to like artificially isolate a line out of a massive, somewhat natural language discourse. Yeah, okay, you're reading Paul's epistle, it's argumentative, whatever. He's going to artificially isolate this and be like, here's a proposition. What can we do with it? And that's good and right, but it's operating in different terms and therefore playing by different rules. I'm not sure exactly what is meant here by analogical, and of course, I'm sure the writer of this knows both allegorical and analogical are said in many modes. Um, I'll just say that, it depends on what Reformed scholastic you're reading. Sometimes they're super uncomfortable with allegory. Origin is the big baddie among Reformed in lots of ways. But then you will have really surprising things that peek through. So I think it was Zanchius one time. I was really startled. This was years ago. Zanchius, he says, and it's right next to each other. He says, "Yeah, God being angered. This is obviously false and only a metaphor." But then, like a line after, he says, "But Holy Scripture treats it as though it were proper, as though it were said proprie in Latin." I was like, man, that's really, really strange. Like you're speaking two sides, out of both sides of your mouth, kind of thing, which is a lot of what this talk tonight was doing. It's like, well, from this perspective, it's that. From that perspective, it's this. So you do have this sort of uh, recognition dimly, I would say, among the Reformed scholastics, but generally they are. So Augustine was really concerned about a lot of this, undercutting the truthfulness of Holy Scripture, and given the constraints that Augustine was working under, letter writing with Jerome, well, wasn't going very well. Letters were being lost, things like this. I don't know how. I mean, Saint Augustine, like, don't argue with Saint Augustine, obviously, but I don't really know how far he solved this problem. How far Origen was got off the hook in Augustine's mind, say. You can get them off the hook, but generally, the Reformed are going to be also very uncomfortable with this sort of approach. And then, particularly as time goes on and you lose Aristotelianism and Cartesianism comes to the rise, you have the scientific revolution. So, a lot of what we talked about tonight is fielded again, um, as a consequence of Galileo and the scientific revolutions that occur. So now the traditionalists, the conservatives are on the back foot and having to defend Holy Scripture and kind of a nasty and inerrancy sort of position against the more liberal, more philosophical, who are pretty willing to just be like, no, there are errors in the text. And by errors, we mean people's false thoughts that the prophets compromise on and are willing to deal with. Like there's been a lot of work done. Generally speaking, Reformed are very uncomfortable with that. Um, I don't think they need to be. In fact, I'm really, really convinced they don't need to be. But the resolution, yeah, the resolution. Yes. I'm all out.